Well, welcome to the Ask Podcast, and we're still discussing this book with Greg Sheridan. We're on to chapter 10, The Great Wall of Heaven, a very cleverly titled chapter. Greg, I'm fascinated by it. I'm fascinated by China, and I'm intrigued by what your qualifications are in terms of writing about this. So you've got a fair bit of experience with China. Do you want to tell us what that is?
Well, I guess that's true, David, although I think, the point about journalism is you write about things you're completely unqualified to write about. That's our shtick, But no, I was in a sense a child of the Cold War, so I grew up concerned with Soviet and Chinese communism all the way through and tales of persecution of Christians. But in 1985, I became the first ever Beijing correspondent of my newspaper. This is my bid to be a footnote in journalistic history rather than an erratum note, And so I was sent at very short notice. The editor-in-chief came along to me. Of course, they were going to send someone else, and he fell through. And the editor-in-chief said, wonderful, lovely Englishman, said to me, "Hello, mate, how are you? What are you doing this weekend?" And I said, "Well, what have you got in mind, Les?" He said, "How would you like to go to China?" So I actually took another week to get my affairs in order. That's the nature of journalism, of course. Opportunity comes along, you grab it. So I spent, a period in Beijing in 1985 as a correspondent, less than a year as it turned out, but it was great to live there. Wonderful time to live there because China was liberalising, and it was in the early stages of liberalisation, but nobody felt there was any limit to its liberalisation. And then I had first got involved in Asian journalism before that, following the Indo-Chinese refugees, and that took me a lot to Hong Kong. And then when I got involved with Southeast Asia, I spent a lot of time in Singapore, and I've been foreign editor of the paper since 1992. I was the Washington correspondent, so I was a Beijing correspondent in 85, a Washington correspondent in 86 and 87, and really from about 1979, I was professionally concerned with Asia in my different iterations. And then after I became foreign editor in 1992, I spent probably 30 or 40% of my time for the first 10 years travelling mainly in the region, mainly in Asia. So I made a lot of trips back to China, and I had a lot of engagement with the broader Chinese world, and especially with Chinese literature, Chinese Christians, Chinese language. When I was in Beijing, I was learning Mandarin. I didn't get very far, but I could ask the cab driver where to go and make a phone call and stumble my way through to the right person, and so on. It's a wonderful experience, and I love Chinese culture and civilization. I don't like the Chinese Communist Party, and of course, once you've had a deep acquaintance with Chinese culture, you feel, in a sense, partly in exile when you're not there subsequently.
I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? I feel like if I believed in reincarnation or whatever it was, I would feel that you are my brother from another century or something, because I share your interests so much. And don't ask me why. Chinese culture has always fascinated me, and I've for years now, I've been reading Chinese history, Chinese works. I've actually started to learn Mandarin. I mean, I did try Cantonese for a while, but it was too difficult. Because I was, my sister was in Beijing for a while, Chinese politics, Chinese history. So I really do envy you in that. Why did you include this in the book, though? This is a book about Christians, and you've got 2 chapters on China.
Absolutely. So one further footnote about loving China. One reason I think it appeals to you and me and to so many Westerners so much, I was greatly influenced by the most brilliant sinologist of the 20th century, a Belgian man named Pierre Ryckmans, who wrote under the pen name Simon Lees, wrote famous, wonderful books, Chinese Shadows, The Burning Forest, wrote a completely original translation of the Analects of Confucius, deeply religious Belgian Catholic. And his love of Chinese culture and his Christian perspective and his deep literary interest, wrote a wonderful novel, The Death of Napoleon. So he really shaped my mind about China. And he was a great scholar of Chinese art and literature. And his thesis is, one reason we find it so fascinating is because it is the most developed polar opposite of Western culture in the human experience. So it is a completely coherent, completely developed, vast culture. He even makes a case that the Analects of Confucius are the most influential book in history, although I think it comes second to the Bible. But you can make that case. I mean, there are as many Chinese in the world as there are Christians, and so on. And the culture is completely coherent, and yet it's absolutely radically different from the West. Why did I include it in this book? Well, the phenomenon of the growth of Christianity in China is one of the most extraordinary stories of Christianity in the last 100 years. So at the time the communists came to power in 1949, there were maybe 3 or 4 million Christians in China. Today, there is somewhere between 60 million and 120 million Christians. Now, for reasons I outline in the book, very, very difficult to get an accurate gauge on how many Christians there are in China. And sometimes Christians can inflate the number a bit, we like to feel like we're winning and all this sort of thing. But even if it's at the low end, say it's 60 million, well, to go from 3 million to 60 million, given the implacable opposition of the communist state at every point. I mean, there were periods where persecution was more intense of Christians and less intense, but this is one of the most astonishing stories of evangelization and Christian growth in the last 100 years that we've ever seen. And Christianity is still the only social force in China that the Communist Party cannot control. And the Communist Party really hates Christianity, not because it appeals to the marginalised and the disenfranchised. Powerful interests around the world often hate Christianity for that reason. But the Chinese Communist Party hates it because it appeals to the well-educated and the thoughtful and the intelligent and the Chinese with a lot to contribute. It also appeals to the marginalised, certainly. But the embrace of Christianity by that kind of person and the way it is a completely alternative structure of meaning and explanation of life and so on to that offered by the Communist Party makes the Communist Party very unhappy about it. And I think really we in the West should do more to celebrate and support Chinese Christians, and we should also draw encouragement from their courage and their example.
Yeah, I agree. It's extraordinary because here in Sydney, much, much more, and throughout Australia, much, much more than in the UK, I'm astonished at how so many churches I go to are there. If it wasn't for the Chinese, the churches would be in decline. Particularly Sydney Anglicans have seen this enormous increase. Basically, you can more or less guarantee that if it's a growing church, there's a significant number of Chinese. I mean, I was recently up in a church in the northwest of Sydney, which has over 1,000 people coming now. They've just started a Mandarin service because they have so many Chinese coming. So that really is quite extraordinary. Incidentally, in that regard, I'd be interested in your view on this. I was speaking to, how will I put it, someone who's a diplomat and who knows the Chinese situation and the Hong Kong situation particularly well. And I said to him that there's a big move in the UK just now to enable Hong Kong Chinese to come to the UK. And some friends of mine back in the UK believe that this will significantly be to the advantage of the church in the UK. And this gentleman said, yes, absolutely. He said he was astonished at how many Christians were in Hong Kong, which, I mean, is that your experience as well? Or
Very much. I spent a lot of time in Hong Kong, one way and another. Everyone concerned with Asian journalism does. The reputation and profile of Christians in Hong Kong traditionally has been very high because of the schools and the hospitals and the other charitable works. So when I was going there in the early 1980s to cover the refugee camps, I mean, just as you'd expect, the people in the refugee camps helping the refugees were, nuns and clergymen and Christian lay people and so forth. The Christian schools, the Christian hospitals have very, very high reputation in Hong Kong, and they are respected and admired, and they have huge numbers of adherents. I'm fascinated what you say about Sydney Anglicans. The same is true, of course, of all the Catholic parishes in Australia. It's not just Chinese, but Asian immigrants generally, Filipinos, South Asians, Indians, Sri Lankans, and so on. And the same, of course, is true of the Pentecostal Church. The Pentecostal churches all over Australia are full of young Chinese. And Hong Kong was especially interesting because in the era of the Cultural Revolution, from the mid-60s to the mid-70s, there was a flood of Chinese refugees to Hong Kong. And this led, indeed, my aforementioned friend Pierre Rickmans to write a very famous book, The Chairman's New Clothes, when without being political about it, the left in the West was saying how fabulous Chairman Mao was, and this was a new society and a new paradigm and everything. Pierre was interviewing the refugees as they arrived in Hong Kong and hearing stories of famine and murder and rape and torture and persecution and, religious figures put in cages in cathedrals and mocked by the public and so forth. And Hong Kong people understood the value of the rule of law, and they were attracted to the message of Jesus and the meaning of Christianity. And Christianity has a very good reputation all through China, I think, except amongst the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, I can see why the Communist Party, though, would fear it, because it's not controllable. I think it's not. I mean, there's a couple of things I want to ask you about that. I should, though, point out, as a proud Scotsman, that we considered Hong Kong to basically be a Scottish colony. We sent bankers and doctors and pastors as well. It's funny, and virtually all the Chinese I knew in Scotland initially, in my earlier years, were from Hong Kong because they staffed the restaurants. I mean, Cantonese was the language. And it's only more recently that, as particularly students have come. Let's stick with you talk about the increasing opposition and persecution within China. Now, I think that failed before under Chairman Mao with the Cultural Revolution. I think he actually aided the spread of the church in some ways. But I wonder what your thoughts are on this. I listened to a number of podcasts. One is a podcast about China all the time. And then another is the Spectator's Holy Smoke, which is basically the Catholic view of the world. And they've talked a lot about the agreement between the Vatican and the Chinese Communist Party, which they regard as horrendous, and I know a lot of Chinese Catholics do. But I wonder if you have any insight or any thoughts on that.
Yep, so let me offer two comments, David. And of course, it wasn't Hong Kong, but the other wonderful popular culture representation of Scottish missionary life in China was Chariots of Fire. And
of course,
Eric Liddell.
Of course, Eric Liddell.
What a fabulous, inspiring life that was. And, the inheritance of Christian missionary activity in China is overwhelmingly positive, hugely positive. I had a great friend, Audrey Donathorne, Oxford graduate, originally an Englishwoman, who devoted her whole life to aiding Christians in China. And she was born there, the daughter of missionaries, and she kept petitioning the Chinese government to award her citizenship and not to be hand racist about it. Just because she was a white woman, they couldn't deny her Chinese citizenship. And she used to flummox them because she's a big Margaret Rutherford kind of woman, and she'd go into China with Bibles secreted about her person. And so they kind of didn't know how to handle her. She was a professor of economics. I digress, I apologise. Two things. One reason the Communist Party hates Christianity so much, it's not just because it's uncontrollable, I agree with that, and not just because political rebellion in China often comes out of religious associations, but for another reason. So some of the people I interview in this book argue that the Chinese Communist Party is itself best understood as a religious organisation. It is a church. It is a monotheism, and the god of the Chinese Communist Party is the Communist Party. And this is not just a metaphor. The Chinese Communist Party does actually have, in the full Marxist sense, its own comprehensive metaphysics. It seeks to provide a complete explanation for the meaning of life from birth to death. It seeks to provide existential purpose for the lives of Chinese people. The purpose is to advance the interests of the party, complete the proletarian revolution, and advance the interests of the state. Xi Jinping is a very orthodox Marxist-Leninist Mao Zedong thought guy. Marxism-Leninism are the eternal principles of Marxism, and Mao Zedong thought is the attempt to apply those eternal principles to China. It's very scriptural, and it cannot abide an alternative explanation of life, which doesn't acknowledge the centrality of the Communist Party. It's weaker on Marxist economics than it used to be, although it is reviving the central place of the state, but it is deeply committed to the Leninist sense of the right structure of society, where the party is the possessor of all power and the vanguard of the revolution. Now, we might regard this as the most dreary gobbledygook in the history of the world, but the Chinese Communist Party not only propagates it, I think it really believes it, certainly at the top. Just as, you know, kings and queens believed in the divine right of kings to rule and so on. So it regards the universal Christian church as a mortal enemy, because the universal Christian church will not recognise the absolute supremacy of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, Chinese Christians, it strikes me, are very much like the early Christians in the New Testament. They're not looking for a fight. They're not trying to overthrow the government. They're not looking for martyrdom. They're very brave, but they don't want to be martyrs. They want to just lead normal, decent lives, and if they can, spread the word about Jesus. But because within that, they don't recognise, and they're happy to recognise the civil authority of the government, but they don't recognise the transcendent, metaphysical, existential authority of the Communist Party. So the Communist Party regards that as a mortal threat. Now then, David, just to offer a comment on this very vexatious Vatican deal with the Chinese Communist Party. So I've interviewed the Vatican foreign minister about this. Oddly, I can't think why I didn't put that in the book, but, it must have just been a sort of an early senior moment. I'm sympathetic with all the Catholics who are unhappy about it and everything and say, don't betray the underground church and all the rest of it. But I do think, and, I'm sort of profoundly anti-communist. There's not one speck of sympathy for communism in me at all. I think, Marx talked of the idiocy of rural life. I think that just showed the idiocy of Marx. And I think every word that Marx said, including and the and but, was a lie. And there's not one speck of me that has the slightest sympathy for it. But here's the thing. The Catholic Church, I think, suffers particularly because it's not able to ordain priests. And Catholic Christianity is a bit different from other versions of Christianity because it's very hard to lead the Catholic life without the sacraments. It's very hard to get the sacraments without priests. Now, the documents of Vatican II are very clear. State authorities should have no role in the appointment of bishops. But it is also, in fact, the truth that in many dictatorships, the Church reaches an uneasy compromise where, in order just to be allowed to exist, it allows the government a certain veto over. The government can't appoint the bishops, but it can veto bishops that it doesn't like. Now, this can have sometimes wonderful, God's providence can work in marvellous ways. Pope John Paul II, who I think was the greatest pope of the last 500 years, or the greatest pope in modern times, and he was the fifth choice or something to be Archbishop of Krakow because the communists kept rejecting choice after choice after choice that the Vatican offered them. And finally they agreed on this guy because they thought, well, Wojtyla, he's a playwright, he's a poet, he's obviously a dreamy intellectual, he's of no consequence, he won't cause us any trouble. And look what happened. He rent the communist world asunder and was the most, as I say, in my view, the most significant pope in hundreds of years. Now, it's still a bad thing if the government gets to veto bishops. But I'm not starry-eyed about the Vatican here. The Vatican has presided over so many scandals, financial and otherwise. I'm happy to criticise the Vatican uphill and down dale. But against my instincts, I've come to understand what they're trying to do with this deal. They're just trying to get to a stage where Catholics can live reasonably unpersecuted and where the Catholic Church can function by consecrating bishops and ordaining priests. Now, it's also the case that since this deal was signed, the government has not led them consecrate many bishops and not led them ordain many priests. And the Chinese Communist Party wants out of this deal greater control of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church out of this deal wants less persecution of its members and more priests. So I'm a little more sympathetic to them than I would have been before I looked into this issue properly, and a little more sympathetic to them than I expected to be.
Well, that's fascinating. Of course, I've got an obvious solution for you. You could all become Protestants.
There you go.
Sorry.
But point that out to him.
Point that out to him, yeah. Look, I'll say to him, look, here's the deal. Anglicans in England can become Catholics if you let Catholics in China become Protestant. Yeah. No, I mean, it's interesting. Let me, coming back to the influence of Christianity on China in other ways as well. I was in a church in Scotland, Robert Murray McShane, and somebody came to his church called William Burns, and there was a revival broke out and all the rest of it. But Burns was a real character, and he came to China, and he was the first person, and there was another much more famous man called Hudson Taylor. And he moved out of the communes, if you like, and he actually wore Chinese dress, learned Chinese, and I think he was a very charismatic character, but he felt that he hadn't been all that successful. Now, where that story comes in is I was speaking to the writer, I can't even know how you pronounce her name, Wan Chang, the author of Wild Swans.
Yes.
And to me, a marvelous book on Chairman Mao, and also a wonderful book that I learned so much. And this was why I was speaking to her, the Empress Dowager, because I was hearing her give a talk on it. And I asked her a question about the influence of Christianity on China. And she said this, and I would want your thoughts on this. She said, in the 19th century, Christianity did not succeed in reaching the ordinary people overall, but it did succeed in making all the modern institutions of China, because she argued that the Empress Dowager, for example, her chief advisor, economic advisor for the railways and so on, was a Northern Irish Christian, that the Christians had an enormous influence on hospitals, education, women's rights, and so on. And by the time it came to the 20th century, she argued that the whole infrastructure, the whole seed and stuff was there for there to be a growth of Christianity, and that there was a general positive view of Christianity. So it was just such an interesting perspective for me, because she said seed that was basically sown in the 19th century came to fruition in the 20th century. And I think she was commenting, not as a Christian, I don't think she's a Christian. She was just making that as an observation, as a Chinese historian. And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's a lot of truth in that, and it's analogous to the situation we were talking about in Hong Kong. So I think about 10% or a bit more, I mean, don't quote me on that figure because I haven't checked it lately, of Hong Kong people were Christians, which is not the overwhelming majority of the society, but Christianity was held in tremendously high regard, and to have gone to a Christian school and so on was a very good thing. What the woman you're quoting is absolutely right, but it actually, in fact, it goes back much further than that. So I would say Christianity had a success and a failure in China. Christianity was very successful with the elites. It didn't reach out as far as we would have hoped with the ordinary people. This was partly because the Chinese government didn't want it to. So it goes back much earlier even than the 19th century. The first big episode of Christianity in China was Matteo Ricci and the Jesuit missionaries in the 16th century. And they were the first, Ricci I think was the first Westerner to learn Mandarin. And the emperor and his court liked these Jesuits because of how learned they were. They understood astronomy, they understood technology, they understood languages. Now, the Chinese court was also extremely learned. These were not barbarians. These were very, very learned men, the Mandarin class. And the Mandarin class found the Jesuits absolutely fascinating. And, in fact, they saw them, and this is an exact echo of what you're talking about the 19th century, as an element of modernisation. So they saw Christianity and its intellectual substance, both its technological intellectual substance, but also its metaphysical technical, intellectual substance, as elements of modernity. But they were very cautious that this not lead to a mass following. And in the book, I quote a dialogue between one of the emperors and a successor to Matteo Ricci, some 17th century Jesuit missionaries. And the emperor really accuses them of the same thing that the Greeks accused St. Paul of. He said, "You are preaching a foreign god." He said, I respect you and I allow your church to operate and so on. But what is to become of us, by which he means himself, he uses the royal plural. What is to become of us if everybody follows your religion and we are no longer, meaning himself, the emperor, no longer the mediator between heaven and earth. We are no longer the son of heaven. We are no longer the object of our citizens' loyalty and love. But this foreign god that you're talking about is the object of everyone's love and affection. And the Jesuits, they can't answer this because there is no good answer for a dictator to that question. You know, the answer is, you're right, the people won't see you as a deity incarnate or a special mediator between heaven and earth. They'll see it as something else. But nonetheless, the ethos of rationality, of science. So Christianity is the great friend of science. It's the great friend of justice. There was a tremendous early theological argument about whether the Chinese practice of ancestor worship could be reconciled to the Christian idea of the communion of saints. So the Vatican had a debate about this that went on for hundreds of years, because Ricci and his successors thought there's so much in Chinese civilization which is already, as it were, sympathetic to Christianity. So the Analects of Confucius are full of splendid ethics. There's a lack in the Analects of Confucius, which is the lack of God, but they are full of splendid ethics. Honour your father and your mother, moderation in all things. The wise ruler has the mandate of heaven, but he forfeits the mandate of heaven if he rules unjustly and persecutes his people. In the discussion I quote between the emperor and the Jesuits, he says, you know, Buddha gives us everything we need. Buddha, by then Buddhism was a big deal in China, and he said Buddha is fine. The Jesuits are saying, no, Buddha's not really God, you know. And he says, well, look, you Westerners can have your God. We Chinese will have ancestor worship, the emperor, and Buddha for anything left over. And that's good enough. And you guys, so long as you restrict yourselves to the court and intellectual circles and so on, I'll let you operate, but I'm not going to let you convert the nation. Now, Protestant missionaries and Catholic missionaries both did produce some wonderful mass conversions and popular followings and so on. But the Chinese state was remarkably effective in taking from Christianity what it wanted, which is good patterns of organisation and modern ways of thinking, but rejecting what it didn't want, which was mass allegiance by the Chinese people. And that is a theme common in Christianity, the accusation of preaching foreign gods, but it's a theme which has been running in Chinese history since the 16th century. And Xi Jinping's abuse of Christians today is very similar to the emperor's discussion 300 years ago.
Yeah, the irony is, I mean, we're going to come back to this next time because you've got another chapter. So chapter 11 will continue to discuss, you know, some of the examples you give. And I also want to talk about what I was told are called ABCs, nothing to do with the television station, or radio, you know, just Australian-born Chinese. But you've hit on something there fascinating. So I'll say one more thing and then you can finish off for us. I was intrigued by, is it Jeremy Barmay's, the Australian sinologist, saying, you quote this in the book, China has a concept of a monotheistic entity from very early on. And I have a theory, and I think I can demonstrate in most of the cultures I know, that rather than the common view of, say, Dawkins, who doesn't really know very much, but he has this idea that we became polytheists, then monotheists, and now atheists is just one step better. I actually think that most ancient cultures were fundamentally monotheist, then became polytheist, often to do with politics and various other things. And it's fascinating throughout the world how there seems to be the fundamentals of a universal ethic, which seems to be based on a monotheistic view of a one creator God. And I was utterly astounded in reading some older Chinese philosophy, even before Confucius, at how this concept of a one creator is not alien to Chinese philosophy or Chinese culture. And in fact, when the Jesuits and the Protestant missionaries and others were coming, they were tapping into something that was already there rather than bringing something entirely new. I mean, they were bringing maybe a different expression or whatever. I mean, do you think that that's a valid way of looking at things? Because I just can't explain why the Chinese are so open to the Christian gospel. I've never met such an open group of people. And I don't think it is just a reaction against communism. I think it's also tapping into something within the culture.
Well, David, I couldn't possibly agree with you more. And I think this theory about the monotheism behind polytheism is profoundly true, and more generally even than China. I mean, my favourite book, I had to choose a favourite book of all time not so long ago, and I chose Chesterton's The Everlasting Man. And he makes this case very strongly. Most polytheisms are in fact monotheistic, so that in Hinduism, there is a monotheistic tradition of Hinduism. So Hinduism has 1 million gods or something, but there is also an idea that behind this, there is a great spirit who created everything. Native American tradition has the same. You know, the moon is a god, the sun is a god, the clouds are interacting with the moon and so on. But behind all this, there's the great spirit. And often the great spirit is kind of unknowable to societies which haven't experienced revelation, but they understand, they know deeply, in my view, deeply imprinted on the human DNA is the sense of God, really God, the monotheistic God. And but people are sometimes, the wisest people in other traditions are sometimes quite modest about their speculations. They say there is a great spirit, there is a creator. So even in this dialogue between the emperor and the Jesuit missionaries that I quote at some length, which I took from Jeremy Barmay's wonderful China history blog. Barmay, I think, is the second most brilliant sinologist I've ever met. He was a student of Pierre Ryckman's, and I'd say second only to Pierre Ryckman's. He's the most brilliant analyser of, and he, unlike Pierre Ryckman's, is not a Christian at all, I think, but reaches a lot of the same conclusions because he's a great scholar. And in this dialogue, the emperor himself advances a Buddhist monotheism. So, as you know, Buddhism, in a sense, doesn't even really believe in God, you know, but the emperor takes monotheism from Buddhism to advance it against the Christian monotheism. So part of what he's saying is, we actually don't need your monotheism. We don't need you Christians to tell us about monotheism, because behind the historical creature of Buddha is the great Buddha. The emperor calls it the great Buddha, who is the author of all things. And I comment in the book, the emperor is really giving his own version of natural law, intuitive, instinctive monotheism. Now, he's got a particular wrinkle on it. He's saying, because we already have monotheism, we don't need your Christianity. I agree with you, David, that Chinese monotheism makes Chinese open to the Christian message, the distinctive, explicit, clear monotheism of Christianity. But I agree with you further. I just couldn't agree with you more. Dawkins is so dishonest in his treatment of these things, and very few polytheist traditions really are closed off to the idea of monotheism. Sometimes, by the way, I think we overclaim what the Jewish, Christian and Islam, you know, we say the three great monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity and Islam. In fact, most religions are monotheistic. The Sikh religion certainly is explicitly monotheistic. The Zoroastrianism is, monotheism. So I believe Christianity is true, Jesus Christ is our Saviour and all the rest of it, absolutely. But monotheism, in a sense, is not the unique preserve of Christianity and Judaism. It's a kind of common human perception of metaphysical reality. And because the Chinese thought about these things in such depth and in such a sophisticated way, It's sometimes wrongly said that Chinese were the only great civilization not to invent a god. That's quite untrue, of course.
Yes.
They had a lot of daily religious practice, but they also had this deep sense of the numinous and the transcendent, and indeed of the monotheistic. It's there for the looking. Of course, the Communist Party, puts a completely different wrinkle on this altogether, and certainly wants to expunge all that. But of course, the Communist Party, although ruthless, is very confused. While I was there as a correspondent, they rehabilitated Confucius, because the first 40 years of the revolution, they thought Confucius was an example of retrograde feudalism, and then they realised actually they really need Chinese national cultural inheritance. So they rehabilitated Confucius, and Confucius became, a precursor of the egalitarian revolution and all that sort of thing. But I do think deep within Chinese tradition is great human wisdom, and not least that openness to monotheism. So I agree with you absolutely about that.
Yeah, and that's the doctrine, if you like, of common grace, and also it's something that both C.S. Lewis and Tolkien pick up on, because they basically say that every story is a pointer towards the great story, and that the whole idea is that you had this humanity made in the image of God. There was this fall away from that, and that actually throughout the world there's been this gradual drift, and then Christ coming brings people back. So I would argue that the monotheism of, well, you certainly had the Zoroastrians as well, but the Jews and Christians, then Muslims and so on, is actually not something that's new or a development that's come in. It's a restoration to the ultimate. And I think if that is true, then we shouldn't be surprised at the fact that there is something within Chinese cultures, because Chinese people are human. I mean, at the extreme Darwinian end, I read some people in the 19th century who professed to be Christians who said, well, actually, the Chinese were not really descended from Adam, or not part of the human race and whatever. Well, yeah, biblically they are. And I mean, it's fascinating. We'll come on to this next week. You've got the chapter, If God is not Chinese, He's not God. I have a suspicion that the 21st century is going to be the century where we see the shift in the church. Well, we've already seen it from the West to China, particularly, also probably Africa, but we'll discuss that next time, Greg. Thank you. And by the way, I mean, I just like it when you go, I completely agree with everything you say. You're such a wise man.
Disturbing for your career, David, but thank you so much. That was great fun today. I look forward to the next one.
All right, we'll look forward to see you in the next one. Bye.
Thanks so much. That was great, David. Thanks so much. How are we going for uploading?
You're